Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this very special session of the Pauline Mayer Early American History Seminar, supported by the Massachusetts Historical Society. This is the final program of the season, and it is a tribute to historian Bernard Bailyn. My name is Kennesorn Wall Street Channelai. I am the Director of Research at the MHS. I'm joined today by Katie Morris, who is the Historical Society's Research Coordinator, and we also have a few members of the steering committee for this seminar series joining us as well. They are Professors Alan Rogers of Boston College, Kate Grandjean of Wellesley College, Lisa Wilson of Connecticut College, Paul Musselwhite of Dartmouth College, and Brendan McConville of Boston University. During the regular academic year, the MHS hosts 7 seminar series. So from September through May, as I mentioned, this is the last program of the year. We hope that you will check back on our website at masshist.org to see what is coming up next season in the Digital History Projects series, the Maier Early American History series, the African American History series, the Environmental History series, and many other ones as well. There's usually something for everyone who is interested in history during this period. And of course, our public programs, which do not revolve around pre-circulated papers, are ongoing over the course of the summer. So visit our website to learn more. On to the program today. Before we get to our panelists and moderator this evening, we at the MHS have a few special remarks to make about Bernard Bailyn, since he was such an important part of our organization for decades. It is my pleasure now to introduce the president of the Massachusetts Historical Society, Catherine Allgore.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everybody. As Kid said, this is a very special evening. So let me start with a little history. The Massachusetts Historical Society elected Bernard Bailyn a member on May 8th, 1958. When he died in Belmont more than 62 years later on August 7th, 2020, he was the Society's Fellow of longest standing. The Adams University Professor Emeritus at Harvard, where he taught his entire career and recast much of what we know about colonial America, he had written more than a dozen books, 2 of which won Pulitzer Prizes, and trained scores of doctoral students, 3 of whom also received Pulitzers. Thousands more undergraduates flocked to his superb lecture courses, notwithstanding his well-earned reputation for high standards, hard grading, and at times even Saturday classes. Scholars as accomplished as Bailyn, arguably the most influential American historian of his generation, are sometimes too busy, too distracted, or too self-important to perform routine professional services. That was not Bud, as his friends invariably called him. The Massachusetts Historical Society was the frequent beneficiary of his energies. His formal services included 44 years on the Publications Committee, 42 of those as chair. He also spent 17 years on the Council at Large, or as it was later called, the Board of Trustees. He served on the Meetings Committee for 18 years and several years on the Membership, Nominating, and Adams Papers committees as well. In those roles, Bud always had an eye to the future and did his part to recruit outstanding individuals to become part of the MHS community. My predecessor, former MHS President Dennis Fiore, remembered, when Bud's term was finally coming to a close, the nominating committee determined that we should continue to correct the male-female imbalance on the Board of Trustees. I drew the short straw and was sent to deliver the message to Bud. And he already had a Harvard faculty member selected and was sure the committee would approve. Joyce Chaplin could not have been a better choice, and I believe the first female Harvard professor to serve as a trustee. Professor Chaplin, meanwhile, writes, if anything, it seems to me that Bud thought the MHS was the most important historical institution in the Boston area, with that place across the river playing a nice supporting role. I agree, Joyce. More informally, Bud Bailyn was always ready to consult on the thorny issue of the moment. Then there were his lectures. well-crafted, incisive talks, so amusing in places that he laughed almost too hard to get his words out. Always supportive of the Society's research activities, on one occasion in 2005, he surprised our grateful former Ford editor and director of research, Conrad Wright, when he appeared for Conrad's book talk. No surprise to us that he attended a portion of our conference in 2015 on the American Revolution. The MHS was not the only beneficiary of Professor Bailyn's commitment to professional service. Bud was also a longtime member of the editorial board of the New England Quarterly. Linda Rhodes, former editor of the NEQ, which was housed at the MHS between 1997 and 2006, remembers him as a great mentor. She said, "Once I felt as if he had faith in me, I worked hard not to disappoint him. His tendency to mete out his approval in small doses and at unexpected times had kept me on my toes, challenging me to do my best. Over the years I had known him, he had been more of a force in my life than he likely knew, and I was most grateful." In addition to the MHS and the NEQ and Harvard, Bailyn also served 5 terms totaling more than 20 years on the Council of the Omohundro Institute. For distinguished service for the cause of history, the Massachusetts Historical Society awarded him its highest honor, the John F. Kennedy Medal, in 2004. The MHS will be honoring Bud Bailyn's legacy by establishing a fellowship in his name. The Bernard Bailyn Fellowship for National History Day in Massachusetts will send one worthy student and their teacher to the National History Day competition in Washington, D.C. each year. The MHS is proud to serve as state sponsor for National History Day, a program proven to prepare students for college, career, and active citizenship. NHD guides students in grades 6 through 12 through a year of historical research and inquiry, interpretation, and creative expression. We can think of no greater way of honoring Bud's legacy as a teacher by having this fellowship nurture the love of history in a new generation of scholars. At the time of his death, Professor Bailyn had been an active and valued member of this venerable institution for more than a quarter of its history. May the members of future generations serve it as well as he did. And now for the program, I'm going to turn it back to Kid Wangshri Chanalai. Kid.
Thank you very much, Catherine. It is now my pleasure to introduce the panelists for this evening. After I introduce everyone, each presenter will have 10 to 15 minutes to discuss some aspect of scholarship that Bernard Bailyn influenced. At the end of this portion of the program, our moderator will make a few remarks before leading the 3 other panelists in a conversation. Attendees may then participate by raising their blue hands or typing questions into the Q&A box. Our first presenter is Jonathan Gienapp. He is an assistant professor in the Department of History at Stanford University, where he specializes in constitutionalism, political culture, legal history, and intellectual history in the Revolutionary and early American eras. He is the author of The Second Creation, Fixing the American Constitution in the Founding Era, which won the 2017 Thomas J. Wilson Memorial Prize from Harvard University Press, the 2019 Best Book in American Political Thought Award from the American Political Science Association, and was a finalist for the 2019 Frederick Jackson Turner Award from the Organization of American Historians. Our second panelist is Alison Games, the Dorothy M. Brown Distinguished Professor of History at Georgetown University. A scholar of early America and the Atlantic world, she is the author of Migration and the Origins of the English Atlantic World. Of this work, Bernard Bailyn wrote, "This is an admirable work of scholarship, intensely researched, clearly written, and pointed in its interpretation. It is a study in Atlantic history, one of the best in that growing field, and at the same time, a real contribution to Anglo-American history in the early modern period." Professor Games's other books include The Web of Empire, English Cosmopolitans in an Age of Expansion, 1560 to 1660, Witchcraft in Early North America, and most recently, Inventing the English Massacre, Amboina in History and Memory. Our third panelist is Mary Bilder, Founders Professor of Law at Boston College Law School. Her research focuses on the Constitution, the founders, the history of judicial review, and colonial and founding era constitutionalism. She is the author of The Transatlantic Constitution, Colonial Legal Culture and the Empire, Madison's Hand, Revising the Constitutional Convention, which won the 2016 Bancroft Prize in American History and Diplomacy, and the James C. Bradford Prize for Biography from the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. It was also a finalist for the George Washington Book Prize. She is working on a book titled Female Genius, Eliza Harriet and George Washington at the Dawn of the Constitution. Our moderator today is Richard D. Brown, Board of Trustees Distinguished Professor of History Emeritus at the University of Connecticut. An historian of the political, social, and cultural history of early America, he has served as the president of the Society of Historians of the Early American Republic and the New England Historical Association. He is the author of, among others, Knowledge is Power, The Diffusion of Information in Early America, 1700 to 1865, The Strength of a People, The Idea of an Informed Citizenry in America, 1650 to 1870, and Self-Evident Truths, Contesting Early Rights from the Revolution to the Civil War. He is currently the president of the New England Quarterly. Professors Gienapp, Games, Bilder, and Brown, thank you for joining us this evening. And first, we turn to Professor Jonathan Gienapp.
Thank you very much, Kit, for that generous introduction. And I'd like to begin by thanking everybody at the Massachusetts Historical Society for inviting me to participate in this conversation this evening, or this afternoon, as it were, out here in sunny California. But I grew up in Massachusetts, and I researched my senior thesis at the Massachusetts Historical Society. So it's nice to be back as the pandemic allows. It really is an honor to have this chance to reflect upon Bernard Bailyn's enormous contributions, truly enormous contributions to the study of early American history. And personally, for me, this is especially meaningful because it was reading what many have long regarded as Bernard Bailyn's most famous book, The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution, back when I was in college, that really propelled me on the path to becoming a professional historian, and specifically one that focused on the period that Bernard Bailyn studied, the era of the American Revolution. So I've been given the task this evening of speaking on Bailyn's contributions, particularly to the study of politics and political culture. And there's a great deal that one could say on this theme. Much of what he wrote on politics and political culture has had an enormous influence on the field, and particularly on my own scholarship. He wrote widely and deeply on the formation of political institutions in the United States following the American Revolution. He wrote deeply on the debates surrounded the making of the United States Constitution, something that I've been struggling to understand for most of my career as a historian. But in the interest of brevity, I'm going to focus on one particular theme that I think really gets to the heart of Bernard Bailyn's approach to the history of politics. That is, how he creatively connected the study of political ideas with political behavior. Because more often than not, these areas of study, ideas on the one hand, behavior on the other, have been held apart or seen to be in opposition or tension. And this was certainly true when Bernard Bailyn himself began studying the American Revolution. On the one hand were those historians who focused on ideas, who emphasized things like the political theory of the Enlightenment, revolutionary ideals, grand constitutional principles like the separation of powers, or the freedom of religion, or the philosophical truths that were written into America's founding documents, such as in the opening words of the Declaration of Independence. So you had one set of historians who focused on these things. And then you had a different set of historians, meanwhile, really in opposition to that emphasis, who tended to dismiss such high-minded principles in the study of the revolution as mere rhetoric or even propaganda, They argued instead that the real history of the revolution lay beneath political rhetoric. It was really in the struggle over competing social and economic interests. It was part of the social struggle that pitted the aristocracy or the oligarchy against ordinary people. And they tended to follow a lesson that Marvin Maier once declared: if you want to know what a politician is up to, watch his feet, not his mouth. They didn't think the revolution would be understood by carefully parsing the rhetoric or the works of political theory that came from it. So intellectual and social history were usually treated as being at odds with one another, especially when it came to the revolution. And often Bernard Bailyn is credited with restoring vitality to the study of revolutionary ideas by most famously, in the aforementioned The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution, taking so seriously the revolutionaries' own writings and expressions during the lead up to independence. But I think it's more accurate to see Bailyn as doing something else than merely restoring vitality to the study of revolutionary ideas. I see him as rejecting this dichotomy between ideas on the one hand and material interests on the other, as rejecting this dichotomy altogether. What he instead tried to do, I think, was to give us an integrated and more realistic account of human behavior, one that envisioned thought on the one hand and behavior on the other as not distinct variables, but really as two sides of the same coin. And Bailyn powerfully connected the two domains of human experience through his creative understanding of political ideology, which he famously unveiled in Ideological Origins, but which he would continue to refine over the course of his career, right up through his very last book, which was published last year. So in probing the voluminous pamphlet writing that preceded the American Revolution, Bernard Bailyn was not really trying to explain the often dense theoretical arguments that the American revolutionaries made against Great Britain in protest to the ways in which Great Britain was intervening in their affairs. Bailyn was not interested in systematically reproducing the revolutionaries' formal legal briefs or their syllogistic logic, that is, their formal political theory. That was not his main ambition. His primary aim instead was to understand why so many people scattered across different colonies and from different backgrounds came to conclude that revolution was not only reasonable, but necessary. Why did the revolution happen? This was the question he cared about. Why did these people at this time take this momentous political step? And in his eyes, neither intellectual nor social historians to that point had really been able to effectively answer this question. It was not as though people read John Locke and were persuaded by his theory of political resistance and then decided on the basis of that it was time to revolt. Nor did he think that people simply rose up mechanically from an immiserated state. These were not realistic explanations. Unlocking the American Revolution meant asking a different kind of question. What meaning did American leaders attach to British policy? What did that policy signal to them about British intentions and what the future might hold? So the British government did all kinds of things during the years that led up to the revolution. They passed all these taxes. They imposed various duties on paper goods or imported goods. They stationed troops throughout the colonies, in Boston most conspicuously. They ended trial by jury in the prosecution of certain crimes, and so on and so on. But these actions, Bailyn was clear, did not speak for themselves. The key was understanding how people at the time interpreted these actions. How did they come to interpret them as so nefarious and foreboding as to demand a revolutionary response, which was not something that most people in their lifetimes took part in? So this required an exploration not of American political theory, but of something distinct, of the shared worldview or political ideology, as he put it, that gave lived experience significance and resonance, the sort of intellectual ingredients that provided, as Bailyn famously put it, an elaborate map of political and social reality. These kinds of ideas are what people rely upon Bailyn argued, to make their world comprehensible, no matter how educated they are, no matter what background they come from. They look for intellectual resources to make their world comprehensible. So here was the great payoff of Bailyn's notion of political ideology. Ideas and arguments, of which there are so many in the world, only become something like ideology when they become politically powerful. That is, when they articulate and fuse, as he put it, into effective formulations and attitudes, things that are otherwise too scattered and too vague to be acted upon. When it crystallizes otherwise inchoate political and social discontent and directs it to attainable goals. So ideology in Bailyn's mind charts the interaction between rational thought and consciousness and our various moods, attitudes, anxieties, and grievances that are rooted in our political and social reality. Throughout his long writings on politics, Bailyn always emphasized words and phrases like attitudes, assumptions, patterns of belief, frames of mind, mental maps. He was far less interested in what he would call disembodied abstractions, formal arguments of constitutional law, or refined theoretical principles of politics. What he was really committed to was studying the ways in which people lifted assumptions and attitudes into consciousness, how things went from inchoate anxieties and convictions that people felt and cared about but didn't quite know how to put into words, and were able to translate them into legible narratives that explained how the world worked, that connected events, that explained what was happening, how people took their own lived political reality and the demonstrations of political power that they witnessed with their own eyes and imbued them with meaning that demanded a certain kind of action. So in other words, rather than choosing between high-minded political theory and baser political interest, as so many had, Bailyn encouraged us to think about the nexus between the two, and did so quite creatively. Now, there have long been important follow-up questions to Bailyn's famous account of revolutionary political ideology, such as how widespread was it? Why were some people seduced by it and not others? Clearly, not everybody in the American colonies supported the revolution, as Bailyn himself charted in his wonderful biography, The Ordeal of Thomas Hutchinson, which considered people who did not support the revolution. There were also questions about how this cut across class and racial and gender lines. And there were also important questions about how much people controlled ideology versus how much it controlled them. But nonetheless, this is still a lesson that I think political historians to this day would do well to instill, because far too often, students of American political history, and particularly of the American Revolution, continue to assume and argue as though ideas and behavior follow different tracks, as though these are different parts of human experience that need to be understood in relation to one another. I think one of Bernard Bailyn's truly great insights that you can chart through his entire work from the 1950s right up to 2020 was seeing how the two were in fact inextricable, and encouraging us, and I think this is especially important now in charged, polarized political times, where there are a lot of people with a lot of political beliefs that don't immediately make sense to everybody, to try to understand from exactly the perspective that Bernard Bailyn did so much to refine what it is that people are lifting up from inchoate anxiety into legible narrative about how the world works. I will stop there for now.
I want to thank the MHS for the invitation. I'm particularly delighted to speak tonight in honor of this new program to support National History Day. I live in Needham with my family, and Needham High School has long supported National History Day. And it's such a great opportunity for teachers and for students. In Bailyn's last published work, he wrote a brief introduction about his own career in history. And he noted that he found his footing in high school because of two extraordinary teachers, Alfred Wright and Samuel Gould. And I think he would just get such pleasure out of the idea that there would be money to support the student-teacher partnership that's at the heart of National History Day. Now, I've been asked to talk about Bailyn's relationship to biography and a little bit to my own work. So first, let me say that Bailyn was not a biographer in any conventional sense. To be sure, one of his most significant books, The Ordeal of Thomas Hutchinson, to which Jonathan and Alison have alluded, was interpreted as a biography. And a certain body of his work focused on various men, be it the New England merchants or the revolutionaries or the writers of the ratification debates. But the life arc, birth to death, of a person was not really his interest. In fact, one can see this in The Ordeal of Thomas Hutchinson, where Thomas Hutchinson's life story to the 1760s is run through in a few pages, simply to show, as Bailyn put it, it was hard to imagine anyone less disposed by background and heritage to betray his countrymen than Thomas Hutchinson. And one has the smallest inkling in reading the book that Hutchinson's death by stroke at the age of 68 in 1780 made him fit even more conveniently into the role in which Bailyn cast him as one of the so-called losers. Hutchinson's biography was simply a vehicle for one of what I want to talk about, two key elements of Bailyn's style of history. Now, this is not everyone's style of history, and it's not the only way to do history. But these two elements are key to, I think, understanding Bailyn's style of history. And so first, Bailyn's style of history focused on the centering of the historian's inquiry on the context. What Bailyn admired, what he aspired to, was to show how at any particular moment, things were not how we had come to understand them to be, and that there was some particular constellation of limiting circumstances, that people had acted and made decisions in a way that was tinged with the tragic, the unintended consequence, the externally impeded advance, perhaps even the unanticipated advancement. Irony, in its original sense in Greek tragedy, where the audience knows more than the characters, was Bailyn's favorite key. But ironic tragedy or tragic irony is unsustainable. And just like the Greeks, like the Elizabethan dramatists, Bailyn leavened it with another element. Not comedy, though as everyone notes, he had a wicked sense of humor, but a deep admiration for creativity. The two most biographical pieces of Bailyn's writing are the memorial minutes that he wrote of Samuel Eliot Morison and Oscar Handland. He wrote them for Harvard after the two men, both Bailyn's teachers, had died. And it's in these two pieces that Bailyn does perhaps the most he ever did in terms of traditional biography, tracing the life arc from birth to death. And yet even here, we can see that what really interests Bailyn was not their lives, but how both men epitomized creativity as historians, a trait that I think Bailyn prized over almost all else. Creativity mattered to the historian. Seeing the creativity in the way that people in the past had acted, or pushed against limits, or imagined overcoming their walls, or rearranged their vocabularies, intellectual grammars to fit new moments. That was the moral of the tragedy. And creativity was thus required by the historian. in escaping one's own time and space to see the tragic limits in some way that others had not seen, in restoring to the characters some agency over the choices they had made, regardless of the outcome. These commitments lay in conflict with a classic understanding of biography. In Bailyn's last book, Illuminating History, he included a brief discussion of the distinction between biography and history. And he claimed to agree with sociologist Paul Lazarsfeld that there were only 3 categories of biography as history. First, where someone was of great consequence in that they shaped history. Second, where the individual was representative of a group of some importance. And third, where the person was an excellent witness themselves and could capture the contingencies and uncertainties of the moment. The remaining versions of biography were just, as Bailyn put it, studies in human character, studies in human nature, and in the fascination of people as such. They might be interesting, but they were not history. And moreover, Bailyn explained that one of the problems with biography, more than any other type of history, was that the authorial stance can get confused. There could become an identification with the subject. And that would mean the author no longer had control over the narrative, could not have a certain ironic capacity. Of course, this was exactly what had happened to Bailyn with Hutchinson. As Bailyn once told me, he got to me. Now, this stance on biography always puzzled me a bit when talking to Bailyn. I've written 2 biographies, perhaps of a sort. One, a biography, a source, a text, Madison's notes, and in the process, I suppose, a bit of a biography of Madison. And the second, coming out next spring, a biography of Eliza Harriet Behrens O'Connor, fittingly perhaps the daughter of Thomas Hutchinson's great foe, Benjamin Behrens, and a female education advocate who gave public lectures in Philadelphia during the convention and who I argue influenced the Constitution. I'm not sure that either fits very well into Bailyn's categories of what were appropriate subjects for history as biography. And I'm not sure that he would completely have agreed with me that Eliza Harriet shaped history or was representative. But what I share with Bailyn in both of these enterprises is this sense that there is value in appreciating and unearthing the inherent tragedy and creativity of past lives. That there is particular value in doing that when the tragedy and creativity of those lives has been somehow obscured by some previous historical interpretation. In telling the story of Madison's notes, I wanted to show that our understanding of the Constitution was not yet possible, that Madison and others were working with great creativity, but not in the way we see the Constitution. In my new book, I want to recover conversely that some women imagined themselves as equal participants in the constitutional state in the 1780s in a way that we have insisted is not yet possible. So now let me turn back to the biographical. Why did Bailyn come to situate his work in this sense of valuing creativity, crashing into existing context, pushing against existing limits? And here I can only share an anecdote. Bailyn was Jewish, which he didn't talk about very much, and which meant something in the 1920s and 1930s, slightly different than it would come to mean after World War II and the Holocaust. He was 5 years older than my own father, who is also Jewish. And late in Bailyn's life, I learned that Bailyn had been at Williams, where my father had been on the GI Bill a few years later. Bailyn described Williams in his most recent book, thinking back on that time where he was there, as a college traditional to in its fraternity tribalism, anti-Semitism, and male chauvinism. And in chatting about this time with Bailyn, I noted that my father had found the experience of Williams intellectually exciting, but the fraternities had not admitted Jews or people of color, amongst others. And so my father had been member of an establishment known as the Garfield Club, with so many other interesting people. And Bailyn listened, and he smiled, and then he answered with wry irony, "Madam, I was president of the Garfield Club." And in this biographical anecdote, one hinting at a life itself formed in creative ambition, and yet nonetheless invisibly bounded and constrained early on by forces beyond the person's control, I glimpse the seeds of what I think was fundamentally so important about Bailyn's type of history. And perhaps that's the reason why this approach to history, employed by Bailyn himself to study white men, often propertied and relatively powerful, resonates powerfully beyond those subjects. For so many of us, in different ways and to differing degrees, constraint and creativity also define the life arcs of our historical subjects and ourselves. Thank you very much.
My assignment for this evening's panel is to talk about Bernard Bailyn from the perspective of Atlantic history. I have 2 points I'd like to make. First, if we consider the first decades of Bailyn's career, the framework of Atlantic history is anachronistic, yet apt. Second, if we look at the last 40 years of his career, the framework is apt, but insufficient. Let me explain. When I say the framework is anachronistic, I mean that it wasn't until the 1980s and 90s that historians started to think of their work as engaging a geographic space they called the Atlantic world. Thus, for much of Bailyn's career, this terminology was not in common use. But Bailyn thought in terms of the Atlantic in his teaching and scholarship before we used that term. In some respects, that perspective was typical for historians who worked in the field of what we then called colonial America, who took it as their responsibility to understand the history of colonial America, which meant at the time primarily the English inhabitants of the mainland colonies, in terms of British culture and politics. The assumption so many historians had then, an assumption that endured through my own training in graduate school in the 1980s, was that it was essential to situate North American history in an English context. And graduate students in colonial history typically did a field in British history for their comprehensive exams. This British context shaped most of Bailyn's works. One early indication of this perspective appeared in the wonderful co-authored article Bailyn published with John Clive in 1954, titled England's Cultural Provinces, Scotland and America. That article showed his interest in thinking about the shared challenges of and creative flourishing in locations beyond the imperial center, and engaged many of the issues that historians who came to define themselves as Atlantic historians pursued. The geographic center of analysis in Bailyn's own scholarship remained, for the most part, the English colonies in North America, but he always insisted on a deep understanding of the broader political and cultural context that shaped that region. There's another way in which his work anticipated approach that we might call Atlantic. I'm thinking especially of The Ordeal of Thomas Hutchinson, his remarkable biography of the last royal governor of Massachusetts, and of course, also an important historian of the colony. Bailyn's biography of Hutchinson was a study of a loyalist, and more broadly, of the culture and phenomenon of loyalism. These days, many historians look at loyalists and understand that their diverse experiences are an essential aspect of the history of the Revolutionary era. But when Bailyn published this work in 1976, Loyalism was not regarded as such a significant story. For colonial American historians and historians of the American Revolution who worked in the 1970s, especially around the time of the bicentennial celebrations, the Loyalists were among many subjects that fell out of national narratives. That absence was especially the case for those Loyalists like Hutchinson, who left the colonies altogether and physically removed themselves from that national history. One of the great virtues of the field of Atlantic history has been its rejection and questioning of political borders and nation states as the key parameters defining the contours of a historical subject. One advantage of this effort to move away from political borders is that places that might seem marginal, or endeavors that failed, or people who moved among multiple jurisdictions can come into view, not because they speak to a single national history, but instead because they can be a part of a new perspective on that and other histories. Bailyn's study of Hutchinson showed an earlier generation of scholars who thought of the Revolution as a national story that there were important perspectives that such an approach obscured. Thus, if we look at Bailyn's career in its first decades, we can see that the perspective of Atlantic history is anachronistic, yet apt. Now let me turn to why I think looking at Bailyn's later career from the perspective of Atlantic history is apt, yet insufficient. It was clear by the 1980s that Bailyn had started to think in more systematic ways about the connections between North America and Europe. This interest was signaled in the two Peopling books, The Peopling of British North America and Voyagers to the West, both published in 1986. But I don't want to focus on his scholarly works, but rather on the leadership role he played in the field, specifically through the International Seminar on the History of the Atlantic World, which he launched at Harvard in 1995. Through the seminar, Bailyn played a singular role in bringing attention and interest to Atlantic history and in supporting the work of graduate students and junior scholars. For 15 years, he hosted the seminar, at which anywhere from 20 to 30 scholars shared pre-circulated papers, got feedback from each other and from more senior scholars, and had the time to forge social and professional bonds that produced new collaborations. Altogether, 366 historians participated in the seminar, and of those, 44% came from institutions outside the United States. Alongside the annual seminar, the program hosted 18 workshops on topics that drew attention to newly available archives, to methods, and to specific subjects. Workshops covered topics including teaching Atlantic history, sources in archaeology, the law, and comparative slavery. The seminar even offered research grants, thus enabling junior scholars to get the financial support essential to carrying out archival research in Atlantic history. The cumulative impact of all of this activity was that scholars who wanted not only to do research in the field, but also to try to teach it to undergraduates and graduate students found the tools to do so and could draw on those helpful binders each workshop generated to find inspiration and resources. This seminar gave Bailyn an opportunity to teach beyond the formal Harvard classroom and on a wide canvas. He didn't teach at these seminars by imparting knowledge. The purpose of the seminar and workshop was for others to share their own research and expertise. But he taught by creating a collaborative culture and modeling collegial engagement. That the field came into existence as it did, that so many historians were drawn to it, was no doubt facilitated in ways we can't really quantify because of the intellectual energy that Bailyn's seminar provided. I don't mean that historians replicated Bailyn's vision of Atlantic history, its subject matter, chronology, periodizations, or approaches. That isn't what happened. Rather, he infused confidence in recent PhDs and junior scholars that their interest in this field reflected an important new development in the discipline of history and encouraged them to pursue their intellectual interests in their own way. Through it all, Bailyn seemed to be having a blast. At seminars, he'd home in on a knotty problem, perhaps wrestling it to death. He'd follow up on an unexpected finding, and he would convey his delight at the intellectual repast he had created for himself and for others. I think he learned a lot too about fields he didn't know well. And it is here that I return to my point about why looking at Bailyn from the perspective of Atlantic history, or indeed any single field of historical inquiry, is insufficient. What I so admired about Bailyn, as someone who had the opportunity to take 2 of his classes as an undergraduate, and whose work he supported in important ways early in my career, was the sheer joy he took in scholarship. I remember listening to him lecture. Sometimes he would start to giggle, and I knew that he was laughing in delightful anticipation of a story he was about to tell us. He loved the subject matter and couldn't wait to share it. In his teaching and in other interactions, Bailyn modeled the delight he found in scholarship, and not just in his own scholarship, although I'm sure that brought him ample rewards, but in the work of others. I think that was his greatest legacy as a teacher. He modeled the importance of taking pleasure in the research you do, savoring the opportunity to share your work with others, and delighting in the work of others along the way. And that is why his impact reached far beyond the specific field of Atlantic history. Thank you.
I want to begin by saying I'm honored to be moderating this session with my distinguished colleagues, and also to say a special word about Pauline Mayer, who was a very good friend of mine and whom I met in Bailyn Seminar in the spring of 1962. Pauline was a truly remarkable and creative person and a force, and the Bailyn Seminar of that era was a very exciting and, I might add, a very challenging experience. I don't feel really competent to say very much about each of the comments that my colleagues have made. I want to add one thought of my own, prompted in part by, as Mary did, reviewing Illuminating History, Bailyn's last book, the collection of essays. And in it, I note something that really seemed to me fundamental about Bud Bailyn, and that is curiosity. A really capacious curiosity to learn about all kinds of things, and his ability to make connections across distances that one would not ordinarily expect. So, for example, he mentions reading Werner Jaeger's Paideia, the ideal of Greek culture, when he was a graduate student, and how the idea that was contained therein about how a culture transmits itself across generations then became the seed of his idea for education and the forming of American society. So this work on the Greek world, seemingly disconnected from early American education, nevertheless came to fruition in that remarkable early work of Bud's. I think also of the Atlantic Seminar, and generally in meeting Bud, almost his first words were, "What's the news? What's happening?" He always wanted to know what people were doing to get more information, more knowledge, more understanding of where scholars were moving and the topics that were shaping them. And that, I think, is characteristic of this Atlantic seminar, which he undertook when his teaching of Harvard seminars, the regular curricular seminars, was over. He then indulged his imagination and curiosity with the Atlantic seminar and brought in so many talented people from across the world and learned from them, and was introduced to ideas about which he was fresh. So I think that's an important point to add. One other thing that struck me in Mary's comment about the losers and understanding, I feel as if Bailyn's effort to understand history, and I believe he even said this in various ways, was an effort to understand himself and his own time and the world surrounding. So, for example, the ordeal of Thomas Hutchinson was at the time greeted by some as being a Tory apologia from someone in the bastion of the Harvard History Department who was resisting change. I don't think that's a reasonable characterization of that work by any stretch of the imagination. But what I do think it represents, perhaps you will agree with me, perhaps not, was an effort to come to terms with someone for whom a rational explanation proved inadequate. The essential point about Hutchinson was that he could not understand the passions that were surrounding him, the to him irrational sense of Britain as tyrant. And I think that was part of Bailyn's own effort. He would have liked, I think, to have lived in a more rational world. Many of us would like to live in a more rational world where one could understand people's motivations and how they responded. I think, again, as Jonathan remarked, he was always seeking, I think, to understand motivation and how people would live their lives. So let me stop with my remarks and see whether there are comments that come in from the chat or questions, and see whether Mary or Jonathan or Alison have anything they wish to add at this point.
The one thing that I'm thinking of is that it's sort of unexpected to me that all three of us landed on thinking about Thomas Hutchinson. I mean, of course, this was sort of Mary's charge in some ways, although she explains why that's a weird charge for this book. But all three of us found something we wanted to say about that book. And I hadn't realized until I was organizing myself for this evening that it had been published in 1976, which, as a child in Dedham in 1976, there was a lot of bicentennial hoopla. So it was fascinating to me to think about that book on that man and that the problem of loyalism coming out in that year. So I wonder what it is about the resonance that we're all finding in that work from really quite different vantage points.
Well, I mean, my immediate thought, a very obvious one, is that we're living in a world in which the irrational and the political are very closely associated.
I think, well, one thing that occurs to me that I think speaks to what Dick said about Bernard Bailyn's limitless curiosity, which I think really propelled him forward to new subjects, was having worked so systematically through the ideological origins of the American Revolution to try to make sense on its own terms of things that might have seemed irrational, that a lot of people thought were strange and irrational, the sort of frenzied fears of the colonists who thought that a slight increase on tax on paper goods meant that they were soon to be rendered political slaves, that once you go through the process of engaging in the empathy necessary to make the irrational rational, then why not turn to the other people living in those identical communities who found something else very different, so rational? And I thought it spoke to his capacity that he could do that. He could dedicate so much of his life to one group of people and then flip to the alternative and give it the same kind of empathy to understand really what Thomas Hutchinson thought, what constrained him, what animated him.
In each case, I think, in all of the cases that we're thinking about, the line, the past is another country, they do things differently there. His emphasis on context and his understanding, fundamental appreciation that however hard we as historians may try, we are living in a different age. We have a different context. But I think he always made the effort to understand the context as fully as possible.
Yeah, I also think that one thing that's that happens to be my favorite of his books, and I think part of what's so appealing about it is that he breaks almost every rule that he set up for himself. By the end, Hutchinson has completely got into him. The authorial voice is completely lost. He's writing as if it's a stream of consciousness. You know, he is Hutchinson in some way, and I think there's a poignancy about that book, particularly the end of that book, which is novelistic. And, I think there's that piece of it that's just sort of like, it wouldn't have, there's just this voice element at the end that is so powerful in that book. But it's, it's really unlike almost everything else he wrote in a lot of ways. The voice there, sort of elegiac almost.
Actually, Lottie mentioned to me that that was his favorite book of all of his works. That was the one that he liked the most, I suppose. And I was enormously impressed by it for a very different kind of reason. When I was doing my work in the period, I read a great volume of Thomas Hutchinson letters in Malcolm Freiberg's transcripts. And you could not help but be impressed with what a dutiful servant of the crown Hutchinson was, and how if anyone could make the colonial relationship work, it was Thomas Hutchinson. And he was just between a rock and a hard place. He couldn't make it work. Structurally, it just wouldn't work. And I think, Bailyn fully appreciated that. I want to just make a plug for John Tyler's edition of the Thomas Hutchinson letters, which make it available with annotation that's far superior to anything either Bud Bailyn or I ever saw. Are there questions coming in from chat?
There are a couple of questions. There are also a couple of hands raised. I'm going to go there first. So we have a question here from Sam Alice. I'm going to unmute or ask Sam to unmute his microphone and ask his question or participate. And then we'll go to Mary Norton.
Unmute, there we go. I think this is a fabulous thing you guys are doing. I mean, I see Hutchinson ultimately as a tragic figure for all the reasons that you guys have talked about. But how critical should we be of him beyond simply that he's a tragical figure? I mean, he was between a rock and a hard place, but don't you think he might have been more sensitive and more effective in his ability to do things? In other words, can't we be more critical of him than simply saying that he was a tragic figure? It strikes me we could, knowing nothing.
I certainly don't see how he could have done better. And, you know, I was a close student of Samuel Adams, and I remember a passage from the moment when, after the Boston Massacre, and the selectmen of Boston and the town clerk paid a visit to Hutchinson to persuade him to have the troops exit the town. And Samuel Adams remarks that Hutchinson's knees were quaking, and he, Adams, delighted in it. And, you know, Hutchinson was up against a very implacable opposition. I don't see how he could have compromised with them. Obviously, he could have let the tea return to England in 1773. That would have been the wiser move. But I don't think that would have changed anything fundamentally. Anybody else want to respond on that?
I think I'm facing a bunch of stalwart defenders here.
Mind you, I think that Hutchinson was profoundly limited, but I think he was limited by his ancestry, his upbringing, the context of elite Boston within which he dwelled, his aspirations for preferment in the British imperial service for himself and for his children, relatives. So, you know, I think he was, as the cliche goes, he was what he was.
One last thing. Couldn't he have anticipated the violence that was going to come better? Couldn't he have expected that sooner or later the Sons of Liberty were going to burn his mansion down?
Well, they didn't burn his mansion down. They tore it up. But in a wooden city such as Boston, even the Sons of Liberty understand that you don't start fires. I don't think so. There's no precedent for the attack on his house.
Thank you, Sam. We're going to go to Mary Norton next.
Hi, everybody. I can actually offer context for the creation of the book, The Ordeal of Thomas Hutchinson, which developed from my own work, I have to say. When I was a graduate student at Harvard, it was Bud who suggested that I work on the Loyalists. And I ended up deciding to focus on the Loyalist exiles. And in the first thing that I did was I started my work on my dissertation was to tackle the Hutchinson papers as they were available to me at the time on microfilm and published and so forth at the MHS. And Bud asked me to write a report on what I had done. I wrote 50 pages on the Hutchinson experience in exile, on Hutchinson and their experience in exile. I have never forgotten when I came back and read, and talked to him about my report. He said, and I quote almost exactly, "If I'd known it was this interesting, I would have done it myself." And then I went off to England to do research on the dissertation in England. And between the time I went to England and the time I came back from England, so that would be the year, the academic year 1967-68, he had read everything. Period. There's your context for that book.
There's also the illustration that his graduate students were very fruitful for him.
Yes. And basically, but he put me onto the Loyalists in the first place. So, I mean, he was interested in them, but and interested in Hutchinson and so forth. But it was because of that I did it, that I did what I did. And then he did what he did. And that's the way it goes.
It's interesting you're mentioning that he put you on to the Loyalists, because he put Pauline onto the Wilkes case and the Wilkes opposition. So, you know, a lot of things, his curiosity was expansive, and he knew an awful lot, and he had a kind of a nose for where there is more to be found if someone will investigate.
I agree absolutely, Dick. He certainly did. And while I have the floor or an unmuted microphone, I want to make a kind of an announcement. I have been asked by the American Philosophical Society to together a memorial for Bud written by people who were his graduate students specifically. And I'm sure there are other people on this call besides Dick and myself who were his graduate students. And so if anybody has anything they want to contribute to what would be a memorial that would be promulgated by the American Philosophical Society, email me at mbn1@cornell.edu. And thank you all for listening to that, call for contributions.
Let's hear from Peter Mancall.
Hi, it's great to hear you. Dick, thanks for hosting this. It's really thrilling to hear this. I have a question, I think, for all four of you. One of the things that always struck me about the ideological origins is, of course, it began as an editorial project, and that that amazing introduction, which then spun out as Ideological Origins, which he then produces in '67. But it's only later, I think it's 73, when he writes that essay in the Central Themes volume, the Kurtz and Hudson, that he talks about his debt to Goetz and sort of how to understand ideas. One of the things that always struck me about him, and I'm just curious about this, is most of us, we write a project, we spend years doing it, we write it, and then we walk away from it. Bud really kept engaging with the topics over time. And I'm just curious if the four of you might like to comment. I use Ideological Origins as an example, but in some sense, I see Thomas Hutchinson as related to that stream of his career, say that stream separate from what Alison talked about. So I look forward to your thoughts. Thanks again for this stimulating, for me, early afternoon.
Let me suggest that Jonathan respond first on this.
Sure, that's a great question, and it's one I'm sympathetic to because I've had the same observation in the past, but certainly in the last week, having the joy of rereading so much of what he wrote from 1967 to 2020 on just this theme. I'm always struck by how the metaphors change a bit from ideological origins to the central themes of the revolution. He goes from talking about minds as switchboards to something more like maps. And I think he was always trying to refine his own vocabulary for understanding how people thought through problems and how things unexpectedly led to unintended consequences. Kind of the propulsive energy of thought is something that I thought he cared deeply about, and he was always trying to find new metaphors for it. So I too was struck rereading the central themes, all the ways it's different than the ideological origins, because he was trying to understand in an ever different way how he might make this case to people who still had questions about the ideological origins. I know a lot of people I noticed in the chat are sort of probing this question of the relationship between ideas and behavior. I think Bailyn, one of the things that he refused to accept simple answers on was the nature of rationality. I think he thought the revolution often was not understood with the sensitivity that it ought to, because people brought to it a ready-made understanding of what was rational or not and imposed that on the period. So either they treated what the revolutionaries did as rational and good, or they saw it as irrational and in need of other explanations. He always challenged people to think about how different kinds of rationality could exist in different ways at different times, depending upon these different mental maps you had. And even if you ultimately concluded that it was somewhat irrational, to take seriously the ways in which it cohered as a way of thinking. I think right up until 2020 in Illuminating History, when he writes that marvelous essay on various ordinary people during the revolution, including some of the people who responded to the 1780 Massachusetts Constitution, and he's going through their analysis and in some cases indictment of what they're reading in the draft that John Adams put together. you can still see at this advanced stage, he has not settled on what he believed 3 decades prior. He's still trying to find ever new language to understand the complex processes by which people understood in a sort of Goethean sense how you connect A, B, and C mentally.
Let's hear from Mark Peterson.
Hi, all. Just a very brief follow-up to the train that Peter started and Jonathan has been commenting on, which is to say he was constantly learning from himself and from the response that he got to what he put out there. So, brief example, 1962, he publishes in the AHR Political Experience and Enlightenment Ideas in 18th Century America. By the time he gets around to republishing that in 1992 in that collection of essays, I think Faces of Revolution, he changes the title, right? Because they're not Enlightenment ideas anymore as far as he's concerned. The experience of editing the pamphlets and then writing Ideological Origins and writing the Hutchinson book made him realize how poor Enlightenment was as a label or as a descriptor of the kind of reaction that he was describing. And so the 1992 version is Political Experience and Radical Ideas in 18th Century America, right? It's his own, everything else is the same about the essay, but what you call it has to be now remarkably different because of everything that he has both taught himself and taught the world and what he's gotten back in response.
I think actually that now the time has come for us to pass to Catherine, or is that true?
We'll give you 5 more minutes since this is such a great conversation. You have 5 more minutes.
Can I say something about this sort of the strands?
Sure, please, Alison.
I'm kind of struck by these two aspects of Bailyn's career. One is what people are just talking about now, which is his intellectual openness in revisiting topics again and again in new ways, rethinking. It's a really kind of refreshing model, I think, for a historian to demonstrate. So there's that pattern, but then also kind of chasing down new ideas. And so both of these things were going on, I think, in his career simultaneously. And I think, Lisa Wilson has this comment in the chat about how historians stay open to new subjects and new ways of doing things. And I think so what's so interesting about Bailyn is that he was both interested in new subjects and new ways of doing things, and simultaneously returning to old ground and thinking it through in new ways. So I'm kind of struck by these two different features of a long and productive career.
I can say that for those of us who were privileged to be at the event where we presented the New England Quarterly's collected papers of the Yale conference on the 50th anniversary of Ideological Origins, Bailyn sat down and gave us a little talk with his reflections on ideological origins. And he found that there were some things the matter with ideological origins. So he could not put it completely to rest. The ideas were still matters of challenge and refinement, 50 years later.
Although I'll tell one story that maybe cuts it the other way about, I think I found in the end enormously splendid about him was also his enormous sense of his own confidence in his work. And so at one point, I'm sure like many people on this call, I was like, well, what do you think about this idea? I was always having ideas, most of which he thought were terrible. And I had this idea of like the 3 Otis siblings, and it would be like a tripart biography. I actually thought I still think it's a pretty good idea. And and he said, "Madam, what is there left to say about that guy, James Otis, that I didn't already write?" And I was like, "Oh, okay, guess I'll just go back and think of someone you haven't written about." And I do think there was, an enormous appreciation for other people's ideas, an enormous creativity, always learning, and yet also, and I think this is part of a little bit of his appeal, this sense that sometimes he might have just gotten things a little more right than other people, and in some ways, I think that when you're going to be that creative and often write in ways that people hadn't, maybe a little tad of that confidence is what gets you through it.
Oh, it's notable that the most important writer of that family, Mercy Otis Warren, was not one whom he chose to pay much attention to.
Well, at that juncture, I had to jump in. Mary, that was a great story. Thank you all so much for this program. I think your presentations brought back very nice memories of being in the room with a mind such as Bud's. And for the rest of us who weren't so lucky to be his student or a mentee, well, we're a little jealous. Thank you all for this great conversation, and thank you to the audience for your involvement. It was terrific. Thanks, everybody. Kid, do you want to jump back on?
Just thanking all of our panelists and Dick for moderating this program. And thank you all of you for joining us this wonderful season at the Maier Seminar. And we hope you'll join us next year. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.